Stranger Things has a problem, one that fans of the show have been making fun of since season 2. Essentially, it's that none of the main characters have died. And this isn't a Friends as Cappy sitcom or a political drama where a death is unexpected. Stranger Things is a hodgepodge of genres, but the main ones are a mix of horror, sci-fi, coming of age, and mystery. The premise of the show is that every season, the main characters team up to face off against a horror creature, risking their lives to save their friends and the town of Hawkins. And this leads to a problem when, after they've done this 4 times, all the main characters are still alive and well. The premise of risking their lives suddenly stops ringing very true, and today we're going to talk about that and why it's a problem. So let's start off with Season 1, Tension in a Bottle. TV shows need a reason to be watched. Competing against hundreds and thousands of other shows for people's attention, keeping that attention is necessary to get people to return. Stranger Things grabbed people's attention with a perfect blend of 1980s nostalgia, which was at a high point in the mid-2010s, extremely good writing, and a stellar mix of the coming-of-age, monster horror, and investigative mystery genre. Another important element, however, is the tension that the story maintains, because to get an audience to care about the characters, they need a reason to. Putting well-developed characters in danger is a great way to make your audience care about them. The tension in Stranger Things comes from whether or not the characters will manage to stop the monster before being killed by it. Season 1 was able to build up that tension amazingly well. Beginning with Will's disappearance, the danger is immediate and present for Will's 3 best friends, Mike, Lucas, and Dustin. It amps up the next episode with the disappearance of Barb, Nancy's best friend, cementing a serial nature to the Demogorgon, meaning that more people will go missing. Just as things seem to be quieting down, the tension is amped up again when Will's body is discovered. Now, characters are being killed, specifically a 12-year-old boy and the best friend of the protagonist. This ramps up the stakes because if they're willing to kill off Will, no one is safe. And the writers drive it home, forcing the characters to attend a funeral and everything. However, it's revealed that the body of Will is a fake, which is possibly the only successful and effective fake-out death the show ever managed to deliver. The audience now doesn't know whether Will will survive or not, but they've seen what will happen if Will is dead, further driving up the stakes. Never given a second to rest, the next episode has Nancy narrowly escaping the Demogorgon, letting the audience have a proper glimpse of it and the nightmare world it lives in. The teeth-covered mouth of the Demogorgon has remained a terrifying element, and anyone watching it can't help but think about how gruesome a death in that mouth would be, continuing to drive up the stakes even though Nancy escaped unharmed. Not to mention, now that the audience has seen its world up close, the reality of rescuing Will from it seems indefinitely more difficult. When Eleven discovers the decaying body of Barb and the barely alive Will, it's another increase to the tension. Barb is officially dead and her body is gruesome. The last thing the audience sees before the finale is Will being attacked by the Demogorgon. All to say, by the last episode, the audience is geared up to watch their protagonists face off against the Demogorgon, risking their lives to protect their friends and town. We know the stakes of their failure, painful deaths, as well as how life will be if they don't rescue Will. On one side, we have the adults, Joyce and Hopper, going into the Upside Down. On another, we have the kids, Mike, Lucas, Dustin, and Eleven, being hunted down by the government and the Demogorgon. Lastly, we have the teenagers, Nancy, Jonathan, and hey, what's Steve doing here? And now a quick interruption for the Steve Interlude. Steve wasn't supposed to survive the first season. In the horror medium, there's a structure to which characters survive and which don't. If you watch enough horror movies, you'll figure out the structure for yourself, and there's even been a ton of horror movies making fun of those old tropes. Generally, if a character has been a low-level antagonist, someone the audience has been rooting against, or has had a last-minute redemption, they're probably gonna die. Season 1 Steve hit all those marks. He didn't really have any plot relevance aside from hosting the party that Barb died at, and blocking the romance between Nancy and Jonathan. He's a popular jock, rich and used to getting what he wants. He hurt the feelings of both Nancy and Jonathan before having a last minute change of morality when he decides to ditch his old friends and go apologize to Jonathan. And that's how he ends up with Nancy and Jonathan facing off against the Demogorgon. Immediately, the audience is primed to expect Steve to die. Unlike Nancy and Jonathan, Steve has no experience with the Demogorgon. He has no idea what's going on, meaning that he's much more vulnerable than the other two. Not to mention, Nancy and Jonathan have booby-trapped the house. Steve isn't just facing a monster, he's also facing friendly fire via their traps he knows nothing about. And an annoying part at watching a lot of TV means that the audience knows patterns. When there's a horror monster and a lack of deaths, it means that someone is probably going to die in the finale. And who better than Steve, who the showrunners can kill off easily because the audience doesn't like him? So, on every level, even subconsciously, the audience was expecting Steve to die. The Duffer Brothers even confirmed that they'd been planning on killing Steve off at first. Which brings us to the finale of Season 1. We've got the adults, the kids, and the teenagers all facing death. Steve with the teenagers is easily the most killable character. And then we watch the fighting begin and Steve doesn't die. Instead, 11, the most powerful and one of the youngest characters, sacrifices herself to kill the Demogorgon. Will is rescued, but at the cost of 11's life. And it's a really good ending. The survival of Steve and the death of 11 are good twists, making a good payoff for the high stakes that had been established all season long. 11's vanishing means that she died, or that she's stuck in the Upside Down, like Will was earlier. Either way, the outcome doesn't look good. It hammers in the danger and the risk that they faced, and is a bittersweet ending to say the least. Even Will, who survived, didn't survive unharmed. He vomits up a slug from the Upside Down, flashing back to it briefly, showing he's still facing lasting effects from it. But overall, the ending of the first season is hopeful. Steve's survival means that he's able to evolve into a nice guy, continuing to go steady with Nancy and buying Jonathan a new camera to make up for the one he broke. Even 11's death is tinged by hope, from the waffles Hopper leaves to Mike staying on the radio. So, looking at the stakes that were raised, it's easy to see that the first season met them. The death and danger the Demogorgon brought meant that 11 had to sacrifice herself, while Will didn't make it back unharmed. These are lasting consequences. And then, Stranger Things got renewed for a second season. And this is where the problem with plot armor begins. Plot armor. Plot armor is a tongue-in-cheek phrase used to explain how main characters survive incredible odds. Is there a whole army shooting at the main characters, and none of them die? How do the main characters of Pirates of the Caribbean, Star Wars, and the latter seasons of Game of Thrones survive? The answer is obvious. There are main characters, and it's a whole lot less fun to tell a story if your main characters keep dying. Plot armor is given to characters who will generally never be killed off. It pretty much protects them from anything more than a few bruises and maybe a broken bone. Normally, plot armor isn't that noticeable, and it tends to be a good thing for the audience. What's the fun of an action-adventure romp if your character doesn't face death and survive? Would I prefer Pirates of the Caribbean to realistically kill off their characters in an action comedy movie? Or to avoid fun battle scenes keep them alive? No, I'd prefer my characters alive and facing fun battles. So plot armor isn't wholly bad, not until it reaches a certain point. And that certain point is the point when it hurts the tension. But why is it more noticeable in different shows and movies? The difference for Star Wars and Pirates of the Caribbean is that, well, they're movies. Plot armor works well in a 120-minute romp. It works a lot less well in multi-season epics like Game of Thrones, which survives off of its continual tension. That's because plot armor and ongoing tension work opposite to one another. If the reason you care about the characters is because they're in danger, then knowing they'll never face death or consequences makes you care a whole lot less about them. But not all plot armor is created equal. There's levels, from the probably should have broken their leg from that jump off the rooftop to the that guy should have been shot and killed when he stood in front of an entire army shooting at him. And of course, there's the infamous level of, he's dead! Oh, never mind. Game of Thrones survived plot armor at the beginning, on the basis that none of its characters had it. That was because there was a large enough cast that they could kill off characters left and right, giving the impression that the main protagonists were at risk. And they did kill off two main protagonists, really showing that no one was safe. Until it started to become really clear which characters kept surviving and who the fan favorites were. And then they killed off their arguably main character, Jon Snow, only to bring him back to life relatively unharmed a few episodes later. And that's when the tension broke. So, looking at Stranger Things, what does it resemble? A 120-minute romp or a multi-season epic? That's a surprisingly hard question to answer. The Anthology Thing. Something that a lot of people have forgotten about amidst 4 seasons is that Stranger Things was supposed to end after season 1. The Duffer Brothers have said to themselves numerous times, and the show itself wasn't renewed until after season 1 had premiered and became a massive success. In fact, they had even talked about the idea of a sequel set in the 1990s, when all the characters were older. So the idea that there would be another season set immediately after meant that they had to transform a mini-series into a multi-season show. And this is where the refreshing season 1 choices they made bit them back. Season 2. Where to go without momentum. The problems with adding a second season to what was meant to be a standalone miniseries aren't hard to imagine. The biggest issue was that the momentum was gone. Everything that had propelled season 1 along, i.e. the Demogorgon hunting down people, Will being missing, and the Nancy Steve drama, had been solved and settled down. All the characters were developed, and there were only 2 remaining loose ties. What was with Will's slug, and what happened to Eleven? But those ties weren't supposed to be anything more than bittersweet ambiguity. And more importantly, Elle's vanishing was a fulfillment of the whole premise of risking their lives. Making their problems worse, I imagine Duffer Brothers faced a massive writing issue when it came down to how that tie should be addressed. From what I can see, they had 3 choices. A. Leave it. B. Save Eleven. Or C. Elle saves herself. They can't do A. Leave it, because that's one of only 2 ties they have left, and if they're making a second season, they want all the material they can get their hands on. So that leaves them with having to address and solve what happened to Eleven, options B and C. The problem with B is that going on a rescue mission to the Upside Down for Elle is essentially the same plot they used in season 1, but switching her with Will. I can't imagine they were very eager to repeat their main arc, which leaves option C. Elle rescues herself. Option C has its own problems too. The largest being, well, doesn't that just erase Elle's sacrifice from season 1 if she was able to rescue herself the whole time? And yes, it does. But I don't think the Duffers had much of a choice, so Elle rescued herself. Now, remember in the Game of Thrones model, the tension didn't break until they revived their main character with no repercussions? Yeah, keep this in mind going forward. And so, Elle's been resurrected and has some plot armor now. But hope isn't lost yet, because there's still one more loose tie the Duffers can make a whole season out of: Will's slug. Will's slug is responsible for 2 whole plot threads, which is double duty. The slug itself becomes part of Dustin's Demo Dog arc, while Will becomes the Mind Flayer arc. And props to Will, that guy is probably single-handedly responsible for maintaining any kind of no plot armor in the second season. He's basically transforming into an extension of the Mind Flayer, going through some pretty awful physical effects the whole time. Will's arc, which begins with him having visions, escalates to the Mind Flayer possessing him, and is a mystery for most of the season. When it's finally clear that he is in danger, essentially whatever damage they do to the monster is also inflicted on Will, these aren't really new stakes. Will is in as much peril as he was last season. He has very little control over his actions and needs to be rescued. But while in season 1 the consequences of his death are clear, this is less true for season 2. The audience knows something bad is happening to Will, but in contrast, during the first 5 minutes of the first season, Will was already attacked and missing. The audience saw his body halfway through, and even when it was confirmed that Will was alive, there was absolutely no guarantee he would still be alive by the time the characters rescued him. The second season tries to piggyback on these raised stakes as the audience doesn't want Will dead, but it's like poking a dead horse and trying to get it to react. We've already seen Will in a way worse situation and survive it. If anything, there's more of a danger of Joyce letting the town burn in order to save Will, which puts Hawkins in more peril than her son. Bringing it back to how they chose for Elle to save herself to avoid repeating the main arc of the first season, I find it strange that they didn't make the same choice for Will's arc. We've already seen him facing a life or death situation where he doesn't have much control over the outcome, but at a younger age and with less knowledge. Why would the audience see him in the same or more danger by redoing it in season 2? So the stakes in season 2 kept worsening. I don't want to say raised because they weren't getting raised, the situation was just getting worse. Will's dying, Elle's off doing her own thing, maybe going a little homicidal. The adults are stuck in Will's mind flayer arc, while Nancy and Jonathan are tying up a loose end that didn't even really need to be tied up. But there were at least new character dynamics. The notable new characters were Max, Billy, Dr. Owens, Murray, and Bob. And this leads to our next aside. Stranger Things has a absolutely massive cast. Having a large cast in a horror-based show isn't uncommon. You kind of need a massive cast to have characters to kill off. It's hard to be a slasher movie when you only have 3 characters. The more characters you can kill off, the more danger your protagonists are in. There are 10 main characters in season 1, of which one doesn't matter, the mom, and the other was seen only in flashbacks, Brenner. Because they were only included in very specific scenes that inform the audience of their roles, the audience didn't really need to keep track of them. So there were really 8 main characters for the audience to keep track of. And Stranger Things divided them into little groups. You had the adults, Joyce and Hopper, the teenagers, Nancy, Jonathan, Steve, and Barb, as well as the kids, Will, Mike, Lucas, Dustin, and Eleven. This was pretty manageable. The only issue being that Mike, Lucas, and Dustin had kind of similar personalities, but it all worked out okay. You may have noticed that my math was wrong. This is because 2 of the characters aren't really ones you have to keep track of. These are, of course, Will and Barb. When the audience first watches Stranger Things, because these characters close friendships with their respective groups, the kids and the teenagers, it's easy to forget they're not mains, especially since you're not focusing on title cards. So when you first start watching, the 10 main characters you keep track of is really 8 main characters and 2 recurring ones who you think are mains. Stranger Things plays the horror trick by quote-unquote killing off Will and Barb early on to raise the stakes, keeping the amount of characters manageable. Into season 2, there's now 13 main characters to keep track of since Will is now a main character and there's been a few new additions. While increasing the cast now that 9 of them have been established earlier on works, it also means there's now a total of 13 characters to keep track of. And little groups they sorted everyone into earlier aren't working very well. Now it's a hodgepodge. There's the kids, Mike, Will, Dustin, Lucas, and Max, the teenagers, Nancy, Jonathan, Steve, and Billy, and the adults, Joyce, Hopper, and Bob, as well as Eleven, who's in her own little group. Except that these groups don't stay together. By the end, it's sort of Will's gang, which is Will, Mike, Joyce, Hopper, Bob, and Owens, the kids, Steve, Billy, Max, Lucas, and Dustin, and Eleven. And it changes again for the finale. Basically, the well-organized and clear groups created last season are a complete mess this time, as characters go to and from, joining and leaving different groups. Normally, I'd be all for this approach. I think keeping clear groups could stifle an ensemble cast and would have prevented some great new character dynamics. Yes, I'm talking about the Steve and Dustin friendship. But it's undeniable to say that it's more confusing than last season. 13 main characters all swarming around each other, and the audience is expected to keep them and their dynamics with the others clear. And unlike the first season, when there were reoccurring characters camouflaging as mains, there weren't any this time. Instead, it was 13 main characters the whole time. Well, like 98% of the whole time. Now to a special mention and a small eulogy for Bob. Bob is Joyce's new boyfriend and stands out as the only main character death in the whole season. He was introduced with all the death markers, similar to Steve was in the first season. He's blocking the romance between Joyce and Hopper, he has a last minute change of heart, and while he wasn't an antagonist, he would honestly lend most of the story by dying. And he does, heroically sacrificing himself. It's a little sad, but it's also hard to carry very much when there's 12 other characters spinning around and the climax hasn't even begun yet. Still, he was around for a whole season and was generally liked by everyone. So, RIP Bob, you'll be missed a little bit. Season 3, Potential Energy. There's a thing in physics called potential energy. Basically, it means that there is literally a potential for there to be energy. If you hold a ball in your hands, there's a potential that you'll drop it. But while it's still in your hands, the energy that would be released in the drop is still only potential energy. This is relevant to Stranger Things because Season 3 is the first season that begins with potential energy. Unlike Season 1, Season 2 was never intended to be standalone. Interviews with the Duffer Bros at the time of Season 2's release have them declaring that they want to go on for 4 seasons, but are open to 5 or 6. The multi-season epic was already in plan, so the loose ties it left were purposeful. Those ties include the Billy thing, the gray smoke that came out of Will, and the last shot of the Mind Flayer being threatening. Essentially, the end of Season 2 is holding the ball, with Season 3 being expected to drop it a little bit, but to raise it higher for the next season. Now, let's just talk about the amount of characters again. We've got 15 mains, and we're including Karen this time because he does things that's more than just being Mike's mom. Now, that's similar to the amount of last season, but now there's a bunch of recurring characters that get killed off. So, at the beginning of the season, there's really around 20 characters to keep track of. We've got groups again, featuring the well-established Scoops troops, Steve, Dustin, Robin, and Erica, the adults, Joyce and Hopper, the teenagers, Nancy and Jonathan, and the kids, 11, Max, Mike, Lucas, Dustin, and Will, while all the other characters kind of float around and get killed around them. It's much easier to follow than in Season 2, and there's just enough communication between the groups that they don't feel quarantined from one another. Although, honestly, there are way too many side characters, I lost track of how they all knew each other, and fodder is fodder, but this is where the plot armor becomes a problem again. Because it's hard to talk about Season 4 plot threads without also talking about the Billy thing. Billy is a strange character. Like, structurally, he makes all the sense and absolutely no sense at all. He's introduced as an antagonist in Season 2, where he's abusive to his little sister Max and he beats up on Steve. And a human antagonist is a good threat for the protagonists who are now adept at dealing with supernatural antagonists, but less so at real life ones. Season 1 had the middle school bullies as well as Steve's friends as human antagonists. Season 2 has just Billy. And with an increase of characters, it makes sense to want your characters to be more efficient. Why have 2 shallow sets of bullies, thus 2 more characters for the audience to keep track of, when you can have just 1 more complex threat? But the problem with human threats in a supernatural world is that human threats are harder to deal with. They aren't monsters, and putting a human threat in the hospital might lead to criminal charges being placed against your protagonist. So it's important that human threats are carefully considered. Billy was not. Max's arc culminates once he manages to drug him to beat him, essentially concluding that they aren't friends, but that Billy leaves her alone now. And I feel that it's very important for the audience to know that Billy has no involvement in the supernatural. No idea it existed, he just was not an active character in that level of the story. He was a human threat. Which is why it was so weird when Billy became this supernatural big bad in the first episode of the 4th season. And when I say that, I mean supernatural big bad in the absolute worst way possible. Going back to Season 3, Billy is possessed at the very beginning of the season, seeing an evil copy of himself. Honestly, it's pretty confusing, but it ends up being revealed as the smoke from the Mind Flayer that was in Will last season. So now, Billy is a puppet being controlled by the same monster that attacked Will. This doesn't really raise the stakes, It just repeats the stakes from the last season, except that now it's impacting a much more hated character as well as a bunch of randoms in town. There's a hint of a conflict they avoided in season 2, which is, can they kill the monster if that also means killing the randoms? But that's not really given any attention. After they fail once to cure Billy, they give up and essentially just shrug and say they have to kill him off. And just to remind you, he was the human threat last season, and now he's a possessed puppet that needs to be killed off. It's honestly the biggest 180. All in all, season 3 led to 2 climaxes: the Mind Flayer and the Russian Gate. Both end with characters dying. Billy sacrifices himself for the kids, while Hopper sacrifices himself to close the gate. This was a great tool to break down the plot armor that has slowly been building since season 2. Hopper was a main character, and not only did that mean his death would have lasting consequences for the other characters, it also showed that no one was safe. If the father figure's last romantic interest could die, why not anyone else? Billy's death, on the other hand, was very predictable, but considering he's been a main character for 2 seasons, even if he was just a puppet in the last season, it still hits against the plot armor. He was a well-connected character, he had dynamics with many of them, and his death had lasting consequences. But then it all became a problem when, like 5 minutes after Hopper died, the audience discovered he was alive again. And this is when the plot armor broke the tension. Humans are pattern detecting machines. The problem with audiences is that we love and hate patterns. Humans, as a species, are insanely good at figuring out patterns to the degree that we'll find patterns when there aren't even any there. And for storytelling, this means humans both have a love for the narrative structure, which, if you were raised within a Western storytelling tradition, is almost impossible to deviate from and still tell a quote unquote good story, as well as a hatred for predictability. This makes Western storytelling a difficult medium, because you have to walk a tightrope with the task of both surprising audiences while making sure your story hits familiar and well-loved beats. Unfortunately, Hopper's resurrection was just a little bit too obvious, and the pieces of the pattern became impossible to ignore. On one hand, you had the season 1 cast, all who were still alive after facing deadly obstacles 3 separate times, and on the other, you had the additions to the main cast, which kept getting killed off one by one. And I just want to take a second to quickly explain how I'm dividing the season 1 original characters from the rest. There's the obvious inclusions: Joyce, Hopper, Nancy, Jonathan, Steve, Will, Dustin, Lucas, Mike, and Eleven, since they've been mains or practically mains since season 1 and have stayed in the show since. But there are some gray areas, like Barb, Brenner, and Karen. They were all in season 1, but had limited roles in the rest of the show. However, I still count them since they've been around since season 1. It's up to you whether you want to consider them to count when I talk about the season 1 original character deaths or not. Another gray area is Max, Billy, Erica, and Murray. They've been in the show for multiple seasons despite not being in season 1. I don't count them in the graphic because they just weren't in season 1. But there's definitely an argument for counting Max and Erica especially into that cast list. So, just to clarify why some characters are marked as season 1 original character and others aren't, despite them having a larger role later on. Humans, like I said, are pattern detecting machines, and by the end of season 3, with the confirmation that Hopper was still alive, the problem of plot armor became extremely noticeable. And this brings us to season 4. Season 4, A Breath of Stale Air. Season 4 was supposed to be different, a breath of fresh air to say. It was longer than all the other seasons and delved back into the small town horror that the first season was all about. While season 2 felt like it was trying to recapture the magic of season 1, and season 3 was diving full in on the 1980s nostalgia, season 4 promised to return to the roots of what made Stranger Things so good to begin with. And for the most part, season 4 succeeded. I'll admit my own biases here. I loved season 4. I actually stopped watching Stranger Things in the middle of season 2 when that was premiering because I felt so let down by the series and hadn't planned on watching season 4 at all until I stumbled on the season 4 trailer. The trailer was so good, that after watching it, I literally rewatched the entire series start to finish in about 10 days just so I could watch the season 4 premiere with everyone else in the world. So, while season 4 exceeded my expectations, there was also a pit in my stomach when we began meeting all the side characters. Before I dive too heavily into that, let's just discuss the cast again. Because if season 3 was large, season 4 was absolutely enormous. I counted 20 characters that had to be kept track of, and I was being picky. There were definitely more characters that could have been included, but honestly, my graphic is just not big enough. So, straight out, a ton of characters, but they kept the lessons they learned from season 3 and kept the group straight. We had the California crew: Mike, Will, Jonathan, and Argyle; the Hawkins gang: Steve, Nancy, Max, Lucas, Dustin, Erica, Robin, Eddie, and Jason; the Russia people: Joyce, Hopper, Murray, Antonov, Yuri; as well as Eleven's little trip, Eleven and Dr. Brenner, aka Papa. So this is obviously a massive cast. Now, going back to the season itself, by this point the pattern of killing off likable secondary characters while keeping the original ones alive was endemic to Stranger Things. So when they introduced Eddie and Chrissy in the first episode, quickly developing them and establishing their dynamics with the other members of the cast, I was concerned. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the characters of Eddie and Chrissy were a breath of fresh air for Stranger Things and were a massive part of the reason that season 4 was such a success. In the past, the side characters tended to be extremely mild, as they were clearly marked for death and didn't have much of a connection to the larger cast. Eddie and Chrissy, on the other hand, oozed personality and charm to the degree that I wondered if maybe, just maybe, they were going to breathe new life into the show. Obviously, I was wrong. Chrissy's death in the first episode took me by surprise, but it confirmed that season 4 was probably going to follow the well-established pattern of kill the newbies while the oldies stay alive. As the season continued with Fred's death, followed by one of the minor antagonists later on, the old characters looked safer than ever. It was extra confirmed when main cast member Max was the only victim to survive Vecna unharmed. Plot armor strikes again. By the end of Volume 1, it was looking likely that someone of the main cast would die, but this went against the plot armor that had been protecting the main cast for seasons now. Add in the fact that there were still plenty of new characters around that could be killed off, odds were that the pattern was going to continue to be followed. Now, let's have some audience participation. There was a rumor that significant characters were going to die in Volume 2. Here is all the characters in Season 4, and if by some miracle you haven't seen it yet, I'd encourage you to place your bets now. Volume 2 ended with several deaths. Jason, a minor antagonist; Dr. Brenner, a multi-seasoned minor antagonist; and of course, Eddie. He fulfilled his arc of running away from problems to fixing them, and then died. Max is killed by Vecna after she volunteered to be bait so that others could kill him. This was by far one of the most unexpected and heart-wrenching parts of the whole show, and the reaction of Lucas is probably one of the best moments of acting I've seen from the show. It's a well-done death scene, one that I was not expecting because the audience already seen Max escape Vecna once, so why wouldn't she survive doing it again? It's similar to the Will issue in Season 2, when it's harder to believe that an older and wiser version of the character would be killed by the same or equal threat when they've survived it already. But the show uses that to convince the audience that Max will be alright. Max certainly believes it, and the only character who seems uncertain is Lucas. It also works in favor of the pattern that has given the main cast plot armor. Unlike the side characters marked for death, Max is marked for survival, which is why seeing her limbs break in midair, the telltale sign for death and an extremely painful injury otherwise, shocks and horrifies the audience. I didn't even believe it for a minute, almost convinced that there was going to be another plot twist reveal that this was another vision of Vecna's. And Max is alive, confessing that she can't see or feel anything, another nail in her coffin, as even if it's just her limbs that are broken, she's blind and paralyzed. And then she closes her eyes and dies, leaving Lucas alone with her body. It's a heart-wrenching moment that breaks the safety speculations the audience had. Max was, out of all the kids at least, the most interesting character and hadn't finished her character arc. Her death felt awful, wrong, and just left me sad. Not just for the fate of the character, but for her absence in the next season. And then Elle resurrects Max. And that's when tension broke again. That was when the plot armor became official. All the main cast is wrapped in bubble wrap. I wasn't sure how to feel when that happened, a mix of happiness because Max is one of my favorite characters, and this meant he'd be returning the next season, but I also felt disconnected from the show in a way I hadn't since I stopped watching season 2. So let's talk about what this actually means and why it matters. Stranger Things has a bad habit of making audience emotions not matter. This has happened many times now. Elle's resurrection, Hopper's resurrection, and now Max's resurrection. And opposite to them is the final deaths of Barb, Bob, Billy, Alexi, Chrissy, Fred, Jason, and Eddie. In another opposite is the still alive original season 1 cast. Resurrecting characters makes deaths not matter. So when you have music cues, the actors crying, and the cinematography all working together to make the audience devastated that a well-liked character has died, it leaves a sour taste in your mouth when they come back to life. It feels disingenuous, and possibly worse, makes the audience feel like the show is moving in place. Side characters show up, bond with the mains, and die. The main cast sacrifices themselves, and they get resurrected to begin the cycle anew, with a new generation of new side characters. In serialized, multi-season shows, this is in part inevitable. Especially in the horror and mystery genre of shows, it's hard to advance the story without a new missing person or a new monster showing up. But it's also undeniable that shows get stale after a while of this. Moving in place can only entertain an audience for a little, before people inevitably want it to move forward. And Stranger Things has a problem with out with the new. I think it's telling to look at how the involvement of some characters has changed throughout the season. In the first season, for example, the main characters played similarly vital roles and combined for the finale. But by the fourth, the California crew don't do much aside from providing some comic relief, while the Russian gang probably should have been cut altogether because of how little they impacted the overall season plot. Really, only the 11 arc and the Hawkins arc pull their weight, while the other two just slow things down. Even more, characters can outgrow shows, especially in shows that are heavily rooted in the coming of age genre. There comes a time in every character's life when they just don't contribute that much to the overall story, not enough to warrant them appearing on screen. I think the California crew is the best example of this. Jonathan contributed literally nothing, Mike was just along for the ride, and Will was just having a time. This in contrast to the Hawkins gang, who, while they aren't all equally necessary to the story, they all provide enough meaningful personal drama that they were an asset to the story instead of slowing it down. I, for one, was ecstatic when all the new high school age students were introduced in the first episode of season 4. They really were a breath of fresh air, a much needed addition to a show that was starting to show its age. As shows get older, the characters develop. This can make it hard to sustain the same characters because whenever conflict erupts, it either gets solved for good or it gets solved temporarily and then reignites in the next season. After 3 or so seasons of this, it can be tricky to find new, meaningful ways for the characters to develop. And this is the beauty of season 4's first episode, which introduced new, likable characters that hadn't been cleaned up yet. In addition to the classic fish out of water Elle, or the party's everlasting conflict of remaining a close-knit group as they get older and grow apart, there was now a cheerleader suffering from an eating disorder, as well as horrific nightmares, and the freak who seemed to be the only person who understood her. These new characters brought new character dynamics and new directions the show could go in. And then, instead of investing in the new, Stranger Things stayed in the comfortable but stale familiar. Chrissy died before really introducing any interesting elements to the show, and Eddie, while fresh, became relegated to the guy who dies role. He was basically a teenage Bob with a leather jacket. Like, that guy definitely isn't a hero, and then he sacrifices himself, proving he's a hero after all. TikTok. By refusing to change the pattern of secondary characters dying and giving the main characters plot armor, the Duffer brothers have hurt the show. And fans are noticing. Unlike past seasons, which were released all at once, Season 4 was divided into 2 volumes. Volume 1, episodes 1 through 7, and Volume 2, episodes 8 through 9, was released around a month later. In the weeks between Volume 1 and 2, TikTok was full of people going absolutely insane about what was going to happen in Volume 2. People were predicting deaths left, right, and center, and the vast majority of people were predicting the death of Steve. He was a fan favorite character who didn't seem to have much more of a role to play in the story since he wasn't involved in any of the plot aside from doing the physical stuff when the group needed him to. His role of babysitter was going away now that all the kids were teenagers, and he was well liked by a lot of the other characters. Killing Steve would have devastated the show in all the right ways. But as soon as these predictions began to get made, opposite ones also started. The Duffers saying they would never kill off Steve because the character was such a fan favorite, not to mention how it would go against the pattern. People also predicted Eddie's death, but that was a lot of hoping they wouldn't kill him off and being relegated to the fact that he was going to die. And then when the episode aired and Steve didn't die, and Max got resurrected, it was surprising to see how annoyed the fanbase was about this. There were countless videos saying Max should have died because it would have been more meaningful. Essentially getting annoyed at the pattern and feeling disconnected from the series because the show wasn't taking its audience's emotions seriously. It all comes together / apart. So I think it's plain to see that Stranger Things has a problem with plot armor. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that the audience has a problem with Stranger Things' use of plot armor. The show has been dealing more and more with plot armor, but it feels like the season 4 finale might have been the tipping point. From season 1, when the plot threads from a should have been standalone season led to the plot armor for Elle, to the second, when everyone but Bob got out unharmed, and then again for season 3, where original cast member Hopper survived while newcomer Billy died, and finally for season 4, which had so many side character deaths that it was the final nail in the coffin, and the audience is sick of it. The premise of Stranger Things was that people risk their lives hunting a monster to save their town and friends. That gives it the tension the show needs to keep the audience engaged. But as the secondary character deaths pile up and the amount of main characters getting resurrected from the dead increases every season, it's clear to me that the premise has shifted from a promise to a lie, with all the original characters covered in a healthy layer of plot armor. Next season is Stranger Things' last, and I am desperately hoping they'll kill off a season 1 character, which makes me sad. I don't think TV shows killing off characters just to kill off a character is a good thing, and as an audience member, I don't want to be rooting for just anyone to die, especially not just to freshen up a show. Doing that to grab the audience's attention tends to lead to a death for shock value rather than a death structured to hit the right emotions that can devastate a caring audience. But on the other hand, if no season 1 characters die next season, the whole premise of the show might ring false and has the potential to sour the audience's feelings about Stranger Things as a whole. And that's why, as excited and impatient I am for season 5, I'm also carrying a healthy dose of skepticism with me. We've seen 3 major characters be resurrected from the dead, and the rest remain unharmed, while a ton of secondary characters have been killed off. I like to think that due to it being the final season, Stranger Things will stop pulling their punches. But I'm also resigned to the show continuing to be stale. The second to last season was the last chance to pivot the show to introduce new conflicts, characters, and dynamics, while the last season will be refocusing on the original characters and wrapping their plots up. It's a little bittersweet that this incredible show got weighed down by the transition from a standalone series to a multi-season one, which forced the introduction of plot armor as well as protection of fan-favorite characters that predestined a lot of them for safety. But I can't see the future. Maybe it'll be even better than season 4 was and they'll find a different way to refresh the show. But in the meanwhile, there's something that's been on my mind. I know you're not here for a hot take, but here's mine. Lucas should have died instead of Max. It would have been a great plot twist and even more meaningful because he was an original season 1 character. I think that the episode should have gone exactly as it had, right until the moment that Lucas is holding Max's dead body. She dies and he cries over her, the camera focusing on his face, until we see Max's hand rise up to brush his cheek. And then the audience knows that Elle has successfully saved Max. Maybe she managed to save Max in time. And Lucas thinks so too, until he opens his eyes and sees that it's Vecna's hand. We switch perspectives to see Max screaming as Lucas is hovering, and realize the truth. Elle did save Max, but Vecna was able to quickly pivot to target Lucas instead, who, unprepared and unsuspecting, can't fight off Vecna. Vecna kills him, targeting the guilt Lucas feels for letting Max be bait. Max tries to find the headphones, but learns they're broken and there's nothing she can do about it. His death is basically a carbon copy of what Max's was, but with the role switch, obviously. I think that would have been a way better way to end season 4 than the way it did end, and I think that it should not have ended with Elle, like, bringing Lucas back to life. I think that if Lucas had died, it would have been a very, very strong finish for the season. And that's the end. This was probably one of, like, the largest things I've ever worked on in terms of, like, a video, so I really hope that you guys liked it. Stranger Things, everyone is talking about it these days, so I hope that I'm not just repeating what other people have said, but actually adding some stuff to the discussion. I really like the series, and I have a lot of thoughts on it, so I thought I'd make a video about it, and I did. I'm hoping to make more videos in the future, probably about similar-ish topics. I'm not super sure yet. So if you want to like leave some comments, let me know what you think of it. If you like disagree with any of my points, I'm like a super big person, constructive criticism. It's my first video, so literally just tell me what's up. And yeah, if I see you again, cool. So bye for now.